October 6, 1973. The eastern bank of the Suez Canal, Sinai Desert, Egypt. Lieutenant Yossi Brenner is watching something that doesn't make sense. Brenner is 26 years old, a signals officer stationed at one of the forward observation posts that dock the Bar-Lev line like knuckles on a clenched fist. He hasn't slept properly in 2 days. There was a holiday yesterday, Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish year. And even here, even on the front line, the atmosphere had been strange and suspended, as if the war itself had agreed to take a day off. He'd been told to watch the Western Bank. He has been watching it for months now. He knows its rhythms, the Egyptian soldiers who appear at predictable intervals, who dig predictable trenches, who seem as bored and sun-blasted as he is. The intelligence reports said there might be movement. There were always reports of possible movement. There had been 40 or 50 such alerts in the past year alone, and none of them had amounted to anything. His commanding officer had told him just 3 days ago that the probability of a full Egyptian assault was low, very low. The Bar-Lev line was invincible. Everyone knew it. So Brenner is watching. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most war legend fans. Don't just scroll, type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. And what he sees does not fit inside any category his mind has prepared for it. There are thousands of men on the Western Bank, not hundreds, thousands. They are not hiding. They are moving with the open, deliberate speed of people who have already made a decision that cannot be taken back. He can see rubber assault boats being dragged to the water's edge, not by small groups, but by organized columns. He can see artillery being rolled forward, positioned openly, almost insolently. He can see bridging equipment, enormous, mechanical, impossible to mistake, being assembled along the canal in broad daylight as if this is a training exercise and no one is watching. He picks up his radio. He tries to describe what he is seeing. He finds that the words don't come easily because the scene in front of him violates every piece of knowledge he has accumulated about how this front line works. His mouth forms the sentences, but some part of his brain is still trying to reject the input, still insisting on an alternative explanation, still searching for the version of this morning where everything makes sense. He is not the only one. Across the Bar-Lev line, in the 16 fortifications strung along 160 kilometers of the canal, other observers are reaching for their radios at the same moment. The reports begin flooding in simultaneously, from north to south, from Counterattack to Port Tufik, and they all say the same thing in different voices. Something is happening, something enormous, something that should not be possible. By every measure that anyone on the Israeli side had ever been taught, this should not be happening. Brenner finds his voice. He asks the question that no one around him can answer. Where, he says into the radio with the flat, careful tone of a man trying to hold himself together, is the Air Force? The Air Force. The invincible Israeli Air Force. The jets that were supposed to arrive within minutes of any Egyptian crossing attempt, that would tear apart anything that moved on or near the canal, that had been the central assumption baked into every layer of Israeli strategic thinking since 1967. The planes that made the Bar-Lev line not just a physical barrier, but a death trap for anyone who tried to cross it. Where were the planes? This question, Brenner's question, asked on the morning of October 6, 1973, is not just a military question. It is the question at the center of one of the most stunning military reversals in modern history. It is the question that, once you follow it to its answer, reveals something deeply uncomfortable about certainty, about pride, about the invisible architecture of assumptions that every powerful institution eventually builds around itself until it can no longer see the world clearly. To understand it, we have to go back 6 years. To a morning in June 1967, when the Israeli Air Force destroyed the entire Egyptian Air Force on the ground in 3 hours and changed the psychological landscape of the Middle East forever. The Six-Day War in June 1967 was a military event that became a myth almost before it was finished. Israel, facing encirclement by Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, launched a preemptive strike that was so precise, so overwhelming, so perfectly coordinated that it stunned the world, including the armies that had been destroyed by it. In 6 days, Israel tripled its territory. It seized the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip. It pushed Egyptian forces all the way back to the Suez Canal and stood there, on the eastern bank looking across at a broken enemy. The lesson the Israeli military drew from this victory was understandable. Air power, applied with speed and precision, could neutralize any conventional ground threat. The Arab armies were large but ineffective. Coordination and quality would always defeat mass and quantity. And most importantly, the Suez Canal itself was now Israel's greatest natural barrier. Crossing it under fire against the Israeli defense forces would be suicidal. Everyone who tried would die in the water. These lessons were correct, given what had happened in 1967. The catastrophic error was in assuming they would remain correct forever. General Bar-Lev was the Israeli chief of staff who gave his name to the fortification line that would one day fail him. The Bar-Lev line, constructed between 1968 and 1969, was an engineering achievement of real ambition. It consisted of 30 strong points built into the sand ramparts along the eastern bank of the canal, with walls of reinforced concrete and fields of fire designed to repel any infantry assault. The sand ramparts themselves, an enormous earthwork barrier running the length of the canal, were 20 meters high in places, designed to prevent any tank from simply driving across when the water was bridged. To cross the canal, you would need to get infantry through the water, neutralize the strong points under fire, bridge the canal with enough capacity to bring tanks across, and do all of this while Israeli aircraft and armor were destroying you. Military analysts who studied the problem concluded it was essentially impossible. General Moshe Dayan, the Israeli defense minister, the man with the black eye patch who had become the symbolic face of Israeli military prowess, spoke publicly about the line in terms that brooked no argument. The Suez Canal, he said, was the best anti-tank ditch in the world, and he was right. As a physical obstacle, it was extraordinary. But Dayan, like everyone around him, had performed a particular kind of intellectual error. He had calculated the difficulty of crossing the canal based on what the Egyptians had been capable of in 1967. He had not asked what the Egyptians might become capable of if they spent the next 6 years thinking about nothing else. Anwar Sadat became Egypt's president in October 1970, after the death of Gamal Abdel Nasser. He was underestimated from the beginning, which suited him perfectly. Western intelligence services and Israeli analysts viewed him as a transitional figure, a lesser man in the shadow of the charismatic Nasser. He was considered a moderate, perhaps even a pushover. He had expelled Soviet advisors in 1972, which many interpreted as a sign of weakness or disorganization. It was, in fact, the opposite. Sadat was preparing a war, and he understood that preparation required a kind of ruthless clarity about one's own weaknesses. Egypt had been humiliated in 1967. The Egyptian military had been exposed as poorly led, poorly coordinated, and operationally dependent on Soviet advisors who often made the decisions. If Egypt was going to cross the Suez Canal, and Sadat had decided, with the quiet certainty of a man who has made peace with a dangerous choice, that it was going to cross the Suez Canal, then every single assumption about Egyptian military capability had to be rebuilt from the ground up. He gave that task to General Saad el-Shazli. El-Shazli was unlike the Egyptian generals who had come before him in ways that mattered enormously. He was physically fit in a culture of military leadership where physical fitness was not always considered important. He was technically precise in a culture where imprecision had been routinely tolerated. And he possessed a quality that is rarer than tactical brilliance in any army. He was willing to tell his commander things that his commander did not want to hear. When Sadat asked for an honest assessment of what Egyptian forces could and could not accomplish, el-Shazli gave him one without decoration. Egypt could not defeat Israel in an open, extended war of maneuver. The Israeli Air Force would destroy Egyptian armor in the open desert. Egyptian logistics could not support a deep advance. The Israeli Reserve Mobilization System, which could produce a fully equipped fighting force within 72 hours, would overwhelm any initial Egyptian advantage if the fighting continued for more than a few days. What Egypt could do, what Egypt could perhaps do if everything was planned with precision, was cross the canal, establish a bridgehead, destroy the myth of the Bar-Lev line, force a ceasefire from a position of dignity rather than defeat, and change the political calculation that had allowed Israel to occupy Sinai since 1967 without serious consequence. That was the mission. Cross the canal, break the line, stop. But between the mission and its execution lay a problem that most generals would have considered insurmountable. the sand rampart on the eastern bank. The Israelis had built it carefully, and they were proud of it. The rampart was not just high, it was structurally dense, compacted sand that would require heavy earth-moving equipment to breach. Bringing bulldozers across the canal under fire was obviously impossible. The standard military solutions, explosive breaching, heavy engineering equipment would all require time that Egyptian forces would not have. Once the shooting started and Israeli aircraft arrived, El-Shazli tasked his engineers with the problem, and his engineers did what engineers do when faced with an apparently impossible constraint. They began questioning the assumptions embedded in the problem. One of those engineers, an Egyptian officer whose name history has not treated with the fame it deserves, came back with an answer that was so simple, so lateral, so perfectly unexpected, that it must have seemed almost like a joke the first time it was explained. Water. High-pressure water. The sand rampart could be dissolved, not blown up, not bulldozed, not climbed over. Dissolved. Water cannons, the kind used in firefighting and industrial applications, could be mounted on boats. Once infantry had crossed the canal in the initial assault, those boats could come forward, position the water cannons against the base of the rampart, and cut through it with sustained high-pressure jets. The process had been tested, quietly, repeatedly, in conditions that matched the Sinai. It worked. It worked faster than any mechanical or explosive alternative, and it required no heavy equipment to cross the canal under fire, because the equipment operated from the water, which was already there. The sand rampart, the thing Moshe Dayan had called the best anti-tank ditch in the world, was going to be washed away with fire hoses. But the water cannons were only one layer of what El-Shazli and Sadat were building. The deeper layer was about the Israeli Air Force. Since 1967, Israeli air doctrine had been built on a single elegant premise, that air superiority, once established, was effectively permanent. Israeli pilots were excellent. They genuinely were among the best in the world. Israeli aircraft maintenance was meticulous, and because the Israeli military was small and operated in a relatively contained geographic space, its air force could respond to threats faster than any adversary could move. The Egyptians had watched this system very carefully for 6 years. They had watched the aircraft types, the response times, the attack patterns, and they had concluded, drawing on Soviet weapons technology that was, in certain specific areas, genuinely ahead of what the Israelis possessed, that the answer to the Israeli Air Force was not a better Air Force. It was a wall of anti-aircraft missiles so dense that no aircraft could fly through it. The Soviets had provided Egypt with the SA-6 missile system, along with SA-7 shoulder-fired missiles and ZSU-23-4 anti-aircraft guns. These systems, used individually, were each capable of threatening Israeli aircraft. But El-Shazli and his planners did not intend to use them individually. They intended to create an interlocking umbrella of anti-aircraft fire that would cover the entire canal crossing zone. The missile batteries would be positioned in overlapping patterns. The shoulder-fired SA-7s would be distributed to infantry units across the front. The ZSU anti-aircraft guns would move forward with the ground units to provide low-altitude coverage. Israeli aircraft flying into this zone would not face one missile system they might be able to evade or jam. They would face 3 simultaneous, overlapping threat envelopes from different altitudes and angles. The mathematics of survival became brutal very quickly. This, too, had been tested. The Egyptians had been running a version of this system during the War of Attrition between 1969 and 1970, and Israeli losses over the canal zone during that period had been quietly alarming to anyone paying attention. The Israelis had paid attention and then had drawn the wrong conclusion from what they saw. They concluded that the missile umbrella was a defensive system, one that protected Egyptian territory, but could not follow Egyptian ground forces if those forces advanced. They were correct about this limitation, but they did not adequately account for how far the Egyptians intended to advance before stopping, or how rapidly the missile batteries could be moved forward. The attack had been planned for 2 years in extraordinary detail. It had been rehearsed so many times that individual unit commanders could execute their assignments with minimal communication. Sadat and El-Shazli had deliberately structured the operation to be, as much as possible, self-executing, to function without the kinds of centralized command decisions that had broken down catastrophically in 1967. Each unit knew its objective. Each engineer company knew which section of rampart it was to breach and with which water cannons. Each bridging unit knew the sequence and timing. And the deception had been, by any standard, a masterpiece. The Egyptians had conducted so many large-scale military exercises near the canal in the previous 3 years that Israeli intelligence had developed a kind of fatigue. The October 1973 mobilization looked on satellite imagery and signals intelligence like another exercise. The canal had seen the same patterns so many times that the unusual had become routine. When Israeli intelligence noted with some concern the scale of Egyptian positioning in early October, the military establishment had a ready-made framework for dismissal. It's another exercise. There was a concept in Israeli military culture called the conceptia. The conceptia, a shared intellectual framework that had been built from the lessons of 1967 and had hardened by 1973 into something very close to dogma. The concept held that the Arabs would not attack until they had air parity with Israel, and that the Israeli Air Force guaranteed that such parity would never be achieved. Therefore, no full-scale Arab attack was imminent. The concept was not a written doctrine. It was something more pervasive and more dangerous. It was the assumption that everyone in the room already shared, the thing no one needed to say because everyone already believed it. The concept meant that warning signs were processed through a filter. Anything that confirmed the concept was accepted. Anything that contradicted it was explained away. This is not a uniquely Israeli failure. It is a human failure, visible in the history of virtually every institution that achieves great success and then protects its success by protecting the assumptions that produced it. On the afternoon of October 5th, an Israeli intelligence officer named Lieutenant Benjamin Simon-Tav submitted a written assessment to his superiors, concluding that an Egyptian attack was imminent within 24 hours. He was not the first analyst to reach this conclusion, and he would not be the last. But his warning, like the warnings of others, was filtered through the concept and found insufficient. At 1:58 p.m. on October 6, 1973, the afternoon of Yom Kippur, when much of Israel was fasting and synagogues were full, 2,000 Egyptian artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along the entire length of the Suez Canal front. The noise was described by witnesses on both sides as physically overwhelming, a sound that seemed to compress the air and make thought temporarily impossible. Within 3 minutes of the artillery opening, 8,000 Egyptian infantry began crossing the canal in rubber boats. The Bar-Lev line, designed as an interlocking system of mutually supporting strongpoints, faced an immediate structural problem. The garrison of the entire line on that afternoon was fewer than 500 men. The fortifications were undermanned. Israeli planning had assumed that reinforcements would arrive, and the strongpoints would be fully garrisoned before any attack began. But the attack had not given reinforcement time. It had come before the warning system functioned, before the reserves could mobilize, before the Air Force could be scrambled. The 500 men in the fortifications fought. They fought with desperate courage against impossible odds, and many of them died, and the line held in places for hours and in some places for days. Sergeant Mati Ashkenazi was one of those men, stationed at a fortification code named Budapest, at the northern end of the line. His position was one of only two that would not fall to the initial Egyptian assault. Ashkenazi and his small garrison held out, isolated, under fire, surrounded, until Israeli forces eventually reached them. He would later walk from the Sinai to Jerusalem carrying a protest sign, demanding accountability for the failures that had led to October 6th. His march became a symbol of something, of the soldiers' right to ask the questions that the generals had failed to ask. By 5:30 p.m. on October 6th, less than 4 hours after the attack began, Egyptian engineers had cut 60 passages through the sand rampart using the water cannons. The bridges were going across. By midnight, more than 800 tanks and 100,000 soldiers had crossed or were crossing the Suez Canal. The Bar-Lev line, the most heavily fortified position in the Middle East, was effectively gone. Where was the Air Force? They came, they flew into the missile umbrella. On October 6th and 7th, the Israeli Air Force lost 35 aircraft in 2 days. Experienced, irreplaceable pilots who had been part of the institution's identity and self-belief were dying in the skies over the Sinai. The SA-6 missiles were performing exactly as Egyptian planners had predicted. The Israelis had electronic countermeasures capable of defeating the older SA-2 and SA-3 systems. They had almost nothing ready for the SA-6. This was not a coincidence. The Egyptians had chosen the SA-6 precisely because they knew what Israeli countermeasures existed. The Air Force, the answer, the assumption, the unstated guarantee at the heart of the entire Bar-Lev line's purpose could not do what it had been expected to do. Not on October 6th. Not on October 7th. Not until Israeli technicians and American intelligence could work out partial solutions to the SA-6 problem, a process that took days that the fortifications on the canal did not have. General Ariel Sharon, commanding the 252nd Armored Division in Sinai, received orders to counterattack on October 7th and drove his tanks forward into an Egyptian defensive position that was now, with infantry and anti-tank missiles fully deployed, a killing ground for unsupported armor. Sharon's counterattack lost tanks and men at a rate that shocked the senior command. Sharon himself was not easily shocked, and what he saw that day clearly disturbed him in ways he did not often allow to be visible. He pushed for a different approach, not a frontal counterattack into the Egyptian bridgehead, but a crossing of the canal in the opposite direction, to put Israeli forces on Egyptian soil, cut off the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd armies east of the canal, and reverse the strategic situation completely. He was right, and it would eventually happen, but it would take weeks and cost thousands of lives, and none of that could unwrite October 6th. Moshe Dayan, facing the collapse of everything he had guaranteed, reportedly said to Prime Minister Golda Meir in those first terrible days that he was afraid they were watching the destruction of the Third Temple. This was not a military metaphor. He meant it in the way you mean something, when the framework you built your entire understanding of the world around is dissolving in real time. He was a man of genuine intelligence and proven courage, and he was watching his concept, the thing he hadn't even known he was protecting, fail in the most comprehensive and public way imaginable. Meir ordered nuclear weapons prepared for potential use. This fact, not confirmed officially for many years, tells you everything about how profound the crisis was in those first 72 hours. Now, Brenner's question makes his full answer clear. The Air Force didn't come, not effectively, not in time, because the Egyptians had spent 6 years answering a question that the Israelis had stopped asking. The Israelis had stopped asking because they were certain, and certainty is the enemy of the question that might save you. The Bar-Lev line failed in one morning not because it was badly built, it was well built. It failed because it had been designed to defeat an enemy that no longer existed, an Egypt that had not learned from 1967, an Egypt that would cross the canal the way they had always crossed things, with mass and noise and the same tactical patterns that Israeli air power could shred. The Egyptians who crossed on October 6th were not that Egypt. They were the Egypt that had looked at their defeat with clear eyes for 6 years, identified every single variable that had gone wrong, and methodically, systematically built a way through each one. Water cannons through a sand rampart, missiles through an air umbrella, deception through repetition, coordination built into the plan itself so that it didn't depend on the kind of centralized command that had collapsed in 1967. Each piece was an answer to a specific question. What killed us last time, and how do we make sure it doesn't kill us again? The Israelis had a concept. The Israelis had a concept. The concept felt safer. Concept felt safer. Concepts always do. They tell you that you already know the answer, that you don't need to look again, that the uncertainty has been resolved and you can stand on solid ground. The question is uncomfortable. The question says, what if we're wrong? What if what worked before only works under conditions that no longer exist? What if the enemy is not standing still while we are? This is not a lesson about intelligence failure, though it was that. It is not a lesson about military doctrine, though it was that too. It is a lesson about the way that success corrupts thinking, slowly and invisibly, until the institution that achieved the great victory is no longer able to honestly examine the assumptions that the victory produced. It was a monument to a particular version of certainty, and like most monuments to certainty, it survived exactly until it met someone who refused to accept its terms. The Bar-Lev line eventually fell because the Egyptians asked why it should exist, not in a philosophical sense, in an engineering sense. Why does this obstacle stop us? What is its specific mechanism? What are the hidden assumptions in the mechanism? And then, one by one, they answered those questions with water cannons, missiles, and 6 years of methodical, humble, urgent preparation by an army that knew exactly how badly it had been humiliated and had decided that humiliated can be a school if you are willing to sit in it long enough. There is something in the name Siman Tov, it means good omen in Hebrew, that feels almost too literary to be true. The analyst who saw it coming, whose warnings were filtered and dismissed, whose assessment sat in a stack of papers, while the Yom Kippur afternoon moved toward 1058 p.m., and the artillery began. He was not a genius. He was not working with different information than his superiors. He was simply asking the question, genuinely, without the pre-filter of the concept, and following it to where it led. Lieutenant Brenner, standing at his observation post with his radio in his hand as the rubber boats hit the water, was looking at an answer to a question his side had forgotten to ask. The scene in front of him was impossible only inside the framework that had been built to explain things. Outside that framework, it made complete sense, was the logical endpoint of 6 years of work by people who had decided that their failure was not a catastrophe, but a curriculum. The war eventually turned. Israeli forces did cross the canal in the other direction, surrounding the Egyptian Third Army, creating a counter-crisis that forced negotiations. The ceasefire came, arranged partly by Henry Kissinger, in some of the most intense shuttle diplomacy of the Cold War era. The outcome was complicated, as real things always are. Egypt had crossed, Israel had eventually counterattacked, and both sides claimed versions of victory that contained enough truth to be sustained. But October 6th could not be taken back. The fortifications could not be uncrossed. The pilots could not be unlost. The concept could not be restored to its previous authority. The Yom Kippur War broke something in Israeli strategic culture that was not fully repaired for years, and some would argue has never been entirely repaired. A comfortable certainty about invincibility that had been built on real achievement, and then allowed to grow beyond what the achievement actually justified. In 1974, there was an official investigation, the Agranat Commission, that examined the failures of intelligence and command that had allowed October 6th to happen. The commission found systemic failures at multiple levels. Careers ended, generals resigned, Moshe Dayan left office. The military chief of staff was dismissed. The investigation was thorough by the standards of most such investigations, but it could not fully answer the deepest question, which was not who had failed, but why. An entire system of smart, experienced, battle-proven people had collectively failed to ask the question that Lieutenant Simon Tov had asked and that the Egyptians had been answering for 6 years. The answer to that question is both simple and terrifying, because asking it felt unnecessary, because the victory of 1967 had felt so total, so comprehensive, so demonstrably correct, that it had quietly transformed from a lesson into a law. And laws, unlike lessons, are not revised. They are simply obeyed until the morning they fail. Brenner's radio crackled. He got a partial answer to his question about the aircraft. They were coming, they were being scrambled, they were on their way. He watched the rubber boats touch the eastern bank in numbers he couldn't count. He did what soldiers do. He reported what he saw, held his position, and waited to see what would happen next. He could not yet see the full answer to his question, because the full answer was not visible from his observation post. The full answer was in the decisions made years earlier, in planning rooms in Cairo where men sat with maps and asked themselves, what exactly is the Bar-Lev line, and what exactly does it need to continue to be believed in? It needed Israeli aircraft overhead. It needed a crossing to be suicidal. It needed Egypt to be the Egypt of 1967. Take those away, and the strongest defense line in the Middle East is a collection of concrete boxes filled with 500 men waiting for a reinforcement that is 72 hours behind, and an air force that cannot fly through what is waiting for it in the sky. No wall failed that morning. No line of concrete and sand gave way to simple brute force. What failed was the assumption underneath the wall, the invisible architecture of certainty that held the physical structure up in everyone's minds long after the conditions that created that certainty had quietly, carefully, deliberately been dismantled, one water cannon at a time. The Bar-Lev line fell in one morning because one side had spent 6 years asking questions and the other had spent 6 years giving the same answer. The answer was never the line, it was always the question.